The hall inside the African Union headquarters was tense, electrified, almost vibrating with the weight of the moment. Delegates whispered, cameras clicked, advisors paced nervously. Word had spread quickly. Netanyahu, shaken by global backlash yet still defiantly unbothered, had requested a sudden closed-door dialogue with African leaders. But no one expected Ibrahim Traoré to walk into that room. No one expected a soldier to confront a man who believed he could intimidate nations with a single sentence. When Netanyahu entered, he didn't greet anyone. He glanced around with the cold impatience of a man used to obedience, not discussion. His eyes landed on Traoré, young, calm, upright, unmoved, and he frowned as though the presence of an African leader at his level was somehow offensive. With a dry laugh, he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for the microphones to catch it, "Africa?" The single word dripped with dismissal, a lifetime of imperial arrogance condensed into 6 letters. A couple of Western diplomats smirked. A few African ministers clenched their fists under the table. Journalists leaned forward, sensing the storm brewing. Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't rush to speak. He simply lifted his gaze, steady as steel, letting the silence grow heavy enough for the whole world to feel it. Then, with a voice that carried the weight of centuries, he answered. "The Africa you mock will decide your fate." The room snapped into stillness. Netanyahu's smirk froze. Cameras zoomed in. Even the security guards shifted, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would echo far beyond politics, something closer to historical correction than diplomatic exchange. Traoré leaned forward, his tone low but powerful. "You speak as if Africa is a footnote. But you forget. Your armies eat from our minerals, your industries run on our resources, your influence survives on our silence. And silence," he said, "is the one thing we no longer offer." The Israeli Prime Minister stiffened, clearly not prepared for such a direct counterstrike. African delegates looked at one another with stolen pride, Western officials looked uncomfortable, the world suddenly felt very small. Traoré wasn't finished. "You shoot missiles at children and call it security. You starve a people and call it strategy. You invade a land and call it God's will. But let me tell you something you have never been told by anyone who looks like me, your power is not eternal. Empires fall. And the contempt you just showed is exactly how they begin to crumble." A murmur rippled across the hall. Netanyahu opened his mouth to respond, but the moment was gone. Traoré had seized it, shaped it, and burned it into history. The silence after Traoré's words wasn't ordinary silence. It was the kind that rearranged the room. Western advisors stopped taking notes. African diplomats lifted their heads with a quiet sense of vindication. Netanyahu, for the first time that evening, looked unsure of his footing. He wasn't used to being confronted, especially not by a man decades younger, a soldier who rose from the dust instead of the political elite. He cleared his throat, attempting to recover his confidence. "Young man," Netanyahu said, forcing a smile, "you speak boldly. But the world is shaped by strength, not by speeches. Israel is a nation of power, a nation that defends itself. A nation that survives because we act, not because we talk." Traoré's expression didn't move. "And yet," he replied calmly, "you tremble at the idea of Africa acting." Several delegates exchanged glances. Netanyahu blinked, surprised by the precision of the blow. Traoré continued, his voice smooth but piercing. "You sit here boasting about strength. But what kind of strength targets refugees? What kind of strength bombs hospitals? What kind of strength needs walls to feel safe from children holding stones?" Netanyahu's jaw tensed. "You don't understand the reality of war." "Oh, I understand war," Traoré said, leaning back. "I lived it. I bled in it. I buried soldiers with my own hands. But even in war, there are lines a human being does not cross. You crossed all of them." A chilling quiet followed. "You say Africa is irrelevant," Traoré added, "but your economies hunt our resources. Your corporations drain our mines. Your currencies shake when we close a border. You think you're untouchable, yet every empire that thought the same now lives only in history books." Netanyahu scoffed, but this time it lacked confidence. Africa will not decide anything. Traoré's eyes narrowed slightly, his tone lowering into something colder, something unmistakably dangerous. Prime Minister, Africa already decides more than you think. And the world you built on our minerals, our land, our silence, is changing. You're afraid of that change. That's why you hide your fear behind loud threats. Netanyahu shifted uncomfortably, his attempt to maintain composure slipping. Traoré didn't stop. You think mocking Africa will protect you. But the future belongs to the continents that have endured the most, not the ones that have caused the most suffering. And Africa, he said, placing a hand on the table, is done suffering quietly. The hall erupted into whispered conversations. Cameras clicked like a storm. And Netanyahu finally realized he hadn't walked into a diplomatic meeting. He had walked into a battlefield, and Traoré was fighting a different kind of war. One he couldn't win with missiles or alliances. Netanyahu's face tightened. The cameras caught it. The small twitch at the corner of his mouth, the nervous blink of a man realizing his usual dominance wasn't landing. He straightened his jacket and leaned forward, lowering his voice but not his arrogance. You think bold words make you powerful, he said. You talk about justice, but Africa has always needed our money, our technology, our protection. Traoré's lips curved into something between amusement and disbelief. Protection, he echoed. You call exploitation protection. You rob a man, then sell him back his own food, and call it aid. You burn down his home, then hand him a tent, and call it peace. The audience murmured. Netanyahu's aides shifted uncomfortably. A Western journalist typed furiously, trying to capture every word before the feed cut. Traoré didn't raise his voice, yet his tone cut through the air like steel on glass. You built your so-called order on the suffering of others, he said. And now, when those others rise, you panic. You fear the world you created coming back to judge you. Netanyahu sneered. You speak of judgment as if Africa could ever stand against us. Traoré leaned slightly forward. Africa doesn't need to stand against you, Prime Minister. It only needs to stand for itself. And when it does, you'll see the meaning of real power, not the kind that destroys, but the kind that endures. The lights flickered from the flash of a camera. The image that spread across social media within minutes would become iconic. Netanyahu's jaw clenched, Traoré sitting still, eyes unwavering, the old order versus the rising one. You see, you mistake silence for weakness, Traoré said. But silence is patience. And patience is power. Africa has been patient long enough. Netanyahu looked away briefly, pretending to adjust his papers, but everyone could see it, he was rattled. The same man who'd lectured presidents and bullied ambassadors suddenly looked small under the steady calm of a Burkinabe soldier. Traoré's words grew heavier. Empires fall not because their enemies defeat them, but because their arrogance blinds them. The very arrogance I just heard in your voice. The room froze again. Netanyahu's lips parted, but no words came out. It was no longer a debate. It was a reckoning. One broadcast live to millions who had waited too long to see someone finally say what history demanded. Netanyahu finally forced a laugh, not because he found anything funny, but because he needed to regain control. You think you're changing the world, he said, waving dismissively. Africa is divided. Poor. Dependent. You're not a threat to anyone. Traoré tilted his head, studying him the way a strategist studies an enemy who has no idea he's already lost. Divided? Traoré repeated softly. You confuse political borders with spiritual distance. Africa's unity isn't written on maps, it's written in wounds. Several African ambassadors nodded subtly. Netanyahu noticed, and discomfort flashed in his eyes. Traoré continued, voice deepening. You see us as weak because you only measure strength in bombs and budgets. But strength is also this. Rising after centuries of theft, speaking after decades of silence, standing after generations of being pushed down. A soft hum moved through the hall, the sound of people recognizing truth. Netanyahu leaned back, annoyed. You exaggerate your influence. Traoré didn't smile, didn't blink. You're afraid of our influence, he said. That's why you mock it. Netanyahu's hand tightened into a fist on the table. Traoré noticed. You mock what you fear, he added. Africa's youth, Africa's resources, Africa's awakening, they terrify you. Because you know that once Africa stops asking, others must start answering. A Western diplomat coughed nervously. Camera zoomed closer. The tension felt like a storm about to break. Netanyahu attempted his final tactic, intimidation. Be careful, he said sharply. Standing against us has consequences. Traoré leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes burning with a quiet fire. I'm not standing against you, he said. I'm standing in front of you, so you can finally see the truth you've spent your life avoiding. Netanyahu swallowed, the movement visible even from afar. Traoré's voice dropped to a low, powerful tone. You wage war on a trapped population and call it survival. You bomb children and call it defense. You break international law and call it destiny. But when someone finally tells you enough, you call it a threat. The hall fell completely silent. No shuffling. No whispers. Only the sound of Netanyahu exhaling slowly, the breath of someone realizing he was no longer in control of the narrative. Traoré delivered the final blow of the moment. Your war is not strength. Your fear is not strategy. And your arrogance, he said, will not stop Africa's rise. The cameras caught everything. And the internet exploded. The clash rippled beyond the conference hall within minutes. Screens in newsrooms, cafes, and military offices lit up with the moment Netanyahu froze under Traoré's words. Commentators scrambled for explanations. Some called it a shift in global power, others described it as a long-overdue confrontation. But in Africa, the reaction was immediate and explosive: pride, fire, awakening. In the hall, Netanyahu adjusted his tie, masking the unease crawling across his face. You speak boldly, he said stiffly. But bold words won't change geopolitical realities. Traoré didn't break eye contact. Reality changes the moment people stop accepting lies, he replied. You built a wall of narratives, he continued. Terrorism, fear, threats. You use them to justify every bomb you drop. But you can't hide behind that wall forever. The truth is coming, and walls fall. A U.S. congressman in the back shifted uncomfortably, sensing the implications. Netanyahu forced a smirk. Truth? You wouldn't survive a week in our world. You don't know what real pressure looks like. Traoré straightened, hands clasped in front of him, calm, unmovable. I've lived under pressure since the day I was born, he said. Colonialism, sanctions, coups, exploitation. Africa carries weight the West couldn't survive for a day. But we carry it with dignity, something your government forgot long ago. The jab landed cleanly. Netanyahu's expression hardened. Traoré continued, his voice resonant. You claim to defend your people. Then tell me, who defends the children under your bombs? Who defends the mothers you've buried? Who defends the journalists silenced, the doctors targeted, the families erased? A hush swept through the hall. Netanyahu's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. He couldn't. Traoré pressed on. You accuse everyone of anti-Semitism when you're questioned. But questioning war crimes is not hatred, it is humanity. And if humanity frightens you... He paused, letting the weight settle. Then that is your confession. For the first time, Netanyahu looked away. Across Africa, millions watched live streams on their phones. Youth in Ouagadougou, Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg erupted in applause at every line. For them, this wasn't just diplomacy, it was liberation spoken aloud. Inside the hall, Traoré finished with a quiet edge. You asked if Africa matters. You mocked our name. But remember this. History is not written by those who shout, but by those who endure. And Africa has endured everything. Netanyahu clenched his jaw, unable to counter the truth staring him down. Traoré leaned back, calm, victorious. "Now," he said, "shall we discuss peace, or do you prefer consequences?" The room erupted, half in shock, half in admiration. Netanyahu tried to regain control of the moment, clearing his throat as if authority could be rebuilt with posture alone. Cameras zoomed in. Advisors shifted. Diplomats exchanged glances. Everyone could sense it, the balance had shifted. The man who usually dominated every room was suddenly defending the air around him. "President Traoré," Netanyahu finally said, "Africa should stay focused on its own internal issues instead of interfering in global security matters." Traoré raised an eyebrow. "Global security," he repeated. "Is that what you call leveling cities? Cutting off water? Bombing refugee camps? If that is your definition, then yes, Africa will interfere." Netanyahu blinked, taken aback. Traoré continued, his tone sharp but controlled. "You lecture us about order. Yet every time the world calls for a ceasefire, you answer with missiles. Every time the UN votes for peace, you choose escalation. You speak of terrorism, but act as if entire populations are your enemy." A low murmur spread through the hall. A few diplomats even nodded. "And you think Africa should stay silent?" Traoré added. "Silence is complicity. We will not endorse your wars with our quiet." Netanyahu leaned forward, irritation growing. "You don't understand the realities of the Middle East." Traoré smiled softly, not kindly, but knowingly. "I understand power. I understand oppression. And I understand what happens when the oppressed finally push back." He paused, letting the silence sharpen. "Ask your generals. Ask your history books." Something flickered in Netanyahu's eyes, recognition, or perhaps fear. Traoré then shifted the conversation with surgical precision. "You want Africa to stay out? Then stop striking civilians. Stop violating international law. Stop turning children into targets. Peace cannot exist when one side believes they are above consequences." Netanyahu's shoulders tensed. Traoré finished with a voice that carried to the back of the hall. "You looked at Africa and saw weakness. But we are billions. We are resources, land, vision, and unity. And if you continue on this path, Mr. Netanyahu." He leaned slightly forward. "Africa won't just speak. Africa will act." The hall dropped into a stunned stillness. This wasn't just diplomacy anymore, it was a warning. A warning the world had never heard spoken so boldly. The air inside the UN chamber had changed. Delegates who once tiptoed around Netanyahu's presence now watched him with measured curiosity, as if waiting to see whether he would crumble or explode. The Israeli Prime Minister's fingers tightened around the edge of his desk. He wasn't used to this. Not to being challenged. And certainly not by an African leader he believed he could dismiss. Netanyahu inhaled sharply. "You accuse us so easily," he said. "But what about your own continent? Wars, coups, crises. Fix yourselves before lecturing us." Traoré didn't flinch. "That is the difference between us," he replied, voice steady. "Africa admits its wounds. You deny yours while creating new ones." A ripple shot through the room. Traoré continued. "You point to our conflicts, but forget who armed them. You point to our instability, but ignore who profited from it. We are healing from centuries of extraction your allies mastered." He paused. "And still, even wounded, we choose peace. Imagine what that says about you." Netanyahu opened his mouth to respond, but Traoré didn't give him the chance. "You stand here," he said, "claiming you defend your homeland. Yet every bomb you drop widens the circle of enemies around you. Every settlement you expand digs another grave. Not for Gaza, for yourselves. Several diplomats exchanged wide-eyed looks. Traoré stepped closer to the microphone, lowering his tone to something almost surgical. You asked earlier why Africa cares. Because when injustice becomes normal in one place, it becomes acceptable everywhere. And Africa has lived through enough injustice to recognize its scent immediately. His gaze locked on Netanyahu's. And what you call defense, we call massacre. Netanyahu's jaw clenched so tightly his cheek twitched. Traoré finished with words that hit the chamber like an earthquake. You said Africa doesn't understand your reality. But it is you who doesn't understand Africa. We are not the shadows of your past. We are the beginning of your future. And if that future demands accountability. He paused. Then Africa won't hesitate. Silence. Heavy, undeniable, electrifying. For the first time in the session, Netanyahu looked genuinely unsure. Netanyahu finally leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from anger to something colder, calculation. He had realized now that the old tactics wouldn't work. Intimidation, dismissal, emotional leverage. None of it had moved Traoré. And that frightened him more than he would ever admit. President Traoré, Netanyahu said, voice deceptively calm, you speak boldly because Africa is far away from the battlefield. You won't feel the consequences of this war. Traoré's eyes narrowed with a quiet fire. Consequences, he echoed. Africa has felt consequences for 500 years. Colonization, extraction, coups engineered in foreign embassies, sanctions, puppet regimes. We've carried burdens you can't even pronounce. A few African delegates nodded, proud and visibly moved. Traoré continued, voice rising, not in volume, but in certainty. You think distance protects us? No. Injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere. Africa is not watching this war from afar. Africa is watching from memory. Netanyahu shifted in his seat, restless. And let me tell you something else, Traoré added. Distance is not weakness. It is clarity. It lets us see what blinded global powers refuse to see, that your war is not survival. It is domination. It is expansion. It is the crushing of an entire population because you fear them. A heavy silence followed. Netanyahu tried to interject, but Traoré cut him off with a single raised hand. You say Africa won't face consequences? Then listen carefully. Traoré leaned in, voice sharp as a blade. Africa holds the resources your industries depend on. The minerals for your weapons, your phones, your satellites. Africa feeds the world you claim to lead. And if Africa decides to close its hands. He paused, letting the meaning land. Your war machine stops. The room stirred, shock, recognition, fear. Netanyahu's face drained of color. Traoré delivered the final blow. You underestimate Africa because you only see our past. But it is our future that should worry you. A united Africa, a conscious Africa, will reshape the world. And if you continue killing innocents. His voice softened into something deadlier than shouting. That reshaping will not be gentle. The chamber remained frozen, no murmurs, no whispers, only the realization that a geopolitical line had just shifted. And Netanyahu knew it. The tension in the chamber had reached a level no moderator could contain. Netanyahu's advisors whispered frantically behind him, shuffling papers, sending texts, trying to find an angle, any angle. To pull him out of the corner Traoré had driven him into. But there was none. Every attempt to regain control only made Traoré's presence stronger. Netanyahu straightened his back, attempting one final counter. You speak of unity and morality, he said, but Africa is divided. You can't even agree among yourselves. What makes you think you can challenge nations like ours? Traoré exhaled slowly, as if he had been waiting for that exact line. Africa is not divided, he said. Africa is awakening. He stepped forward. And there is nothing more dangerous to oppressive powers than an awakened continent. Some delegates began to clap before stopping themselves, caught between diplomacy and instinct. Traoré's tone deepened. For decades, you and your allies treated Africa like a marketplace. A resource pit. A chessboard. But this generation, my generation, has burned that chessboard. We won't be your pawns. We won't be your mines. We won't be your allies in silence. He motioned toward the African delegates behind him. We will be your mirror. And you don't like what you see. Netanyahu's lips tightened, but he stayed silent. You said Africa cannot challenge you, Traoré went on. But ask yourself, what happens when the world's youngest population, richest resources, and fastest-growing economies choose justice over obedience? He let the question hang, unanswered. Then Traoré delivered the line that would be replayed on every screen across the world. You fear Africa not because we are weak, but because you finally realize we are no longer afraid of you. A wave of murmurs swept through the hall. Netanyahu looked shaken, eyes darting, jaw tense, posture rigid. Traoré wasn't finished. You want to know why Africa stands with Gaza? Because we recognize the look in a child's eyes when their home is gone. Because we have carried colonizers on our backs and buried dictators installed by foreign hands. We know suffering. And we never forget the face of the one who caused it. He paused, his gaze steady and unyielding. And today, Mr. Netanyahu, the world sees the face. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was historic. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath as Traoré stepped back from the microphone. The weight of his words lingered in the air, settling like thunder after a lightning strike. Netanyahu sat frozen, stunned into silence. A rare sight for a man who built a career on dominating every room he entered. But this time, he wasn't facing just another politician. He was facing a soldier forged in the fires of a continent that refused to die. The moderator, visibly shaken, attempted to move to the next speaker, but the moment was too charged to ignore. Cameras around the room zoomed in on Traoré's expression, calm, controlled, unbreakable. For millions watching live, that calmness was the loudest victory of all. A reporter dared to call out, President Traoré, any final message to the international community? Traoré turned, the corner of his mouth lifting in a controlled, almost dangerous half-smile. Yes, he said. 1. He looked directly at Netanyahu. Power is not measured by the size of your army, he said. It is measured by the size of your conscience. And some nations, no matter how strong they pretend to be, have none left. A stunned gasp spread through the chamber. Netanyahu opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. Traoré continued. You claim this is your war. You claim the world must accept it. But history does not accept brutality, it records it. And one day, when your grandchildren look for your legacy, they will not find heroism. They will find rubble. Netanyahu stiffened, eyes glistening with suppressed fury. Traoré delivered the final strike. You mocked Africa, he said. But Africa rises. And when justice comes, it does not knock. It enters. The entire African bloc rose to their feet in applause. Then, one by one, Middle Eastern, South American, and Asian delegates followed until half the hall was standing. Netanyahu remained seated, isolated in a room he once expected to command. By the time Traoré stepped away from the podium, the narrative had shifted. International headlines were already being written. Africa finally speaks back. Traoré silences Netanyahu at the UN. A new global voice is rising. Outside, crowds in cities across Africa chanted his name. In Gaza, families watching live streams whispered prayers of gratitude. Even in Western capitals, analysts admitted privately. This was a turning point. As Traoré left the chamber, one of his advisors walked beside him. "Mr. President," he said quietly, "the world will react strongly." Traoré adjusted his jacket. "Good," he replied. "Let them." Then he added, without slowing. "Because Africa's silence ended today." And behind him, Netanyahu sat alone, still, defeated, and aware that the world had just witnessed the moment his voice lost its power.